May you live in interesting times. Nobody quite knows where this proverb came from, but we all have a pretty good idea of the sentiments that it conveys. Interesting times are unsettling times, times of big changes and of great potential upheaval. We, and by we I mean humanity globally, all of us, are certainly living in interesting times. There are plenty of signs around us that tell us so, and in particular when we regard and look at the natural world. And it's not just about climate change, as important, disturbing, and real as that is. It is also about biodiversity loss more generally, about the maintenance of the continuous health of habitats and ecosystems all over the world. And it is very much about us. We may think that individually we have next to nothing to do with it, but collectively we have brought this current situation about. So, when we look at dried out riverbeds, melting glaciers, starving herds of deer, or skies without birds in them, we are looking into the mirror of our collective actions. So, how did we come to live in such interesting times? How did we manage to convince ourselves to expect huge changes to our natural environment on the other hand, while at the same time not anticipating pretty much any changes to the social, political, and economic institutions that we live in and live with? That's a big puzzle, and clearly that's not very plausible, but we have done so. How did we manage to do that? In order to begin to answer such questions, and similar ones, I want to take us back to the 18th century, actually, and to the Industrial Revolution, and to what was, at that particular point, the emergence of what has been called by social scientists the social question. The Industrial Revolution ushered in a period of enormous productivity and wealth creation. And this productivity and wealth creation was spread by way of colonialism and colonial exploitation also across the world. But at the same time, it created, for the first time on a massive scale, mass poverty. And this is what has been referred to as the social question. The social question was a direct outcome of the way in which we handled the transformation of the Industrial Revolution. Another thing to know about the Industrial Revolution is that before and after, the political and social institutions that we have lived with changed fundamentally. Nothing remained the same over that period. Why am I running through this? Because that's a very good analogy to what it is that we are currently facing, even if we just don't know it quite yet. The changes that we're about to experience must be of a similar scale, if not more. So the analogy with the social question is what drives this particular point. Now, how are we to think about the changes that we have to maybe incur as a result of all of this? How can we begin to make sense of that particular situation that we have inherited from the Industrial Revolution and the development projects that it set in motion? Because, as it is clear, not only poverty was created by the Industrial Revolution, but also, and quite importantly, an enormous amount of environmental degradation. You can just open Charles Dickens's novels where he writes about London anywhere in the 19th century, and you'll find references to poisoned streams, to sooty and smoke-filled air, and to garbage piles piling up everywhere, and references to those in the population who are most exposed to all of this. Now, that's a really big problem. We have this particular setup, the paradigm of a potential social struggle that emerges from the deprivation that people were experiencing, leading to a whole set of new social and political problems. And this is what drove, in part, these big transformations of political institutions that I talked about before. So people were struggling in the colonies, everywhere in the world, but also back in the heartlands of industrial capitalism, against their deprivation and their exclusion. The mode of struggle generated new sets of responses, but the main response to it was, and this is very important, development. Development became the response, the answer to the social question. And its promise went something like this. All you have to do is industrialize, specialize, grow, trade. And what we will get is a cake that's big enough for everyone to have a share of it. And that promise, by the way, is a promise that if you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals agenda that we have going on right now, we are still making. The problem is that it hasn't worked, right? We have had poverty and mass exclusion since then. It is still with us. The promise to address it by way of going to a development paradigm to get everyone on board with this particular form of economic development has delivered no solution to the social question yet, but at the same time, it has exacerbated those detrimental tendencies that were already there in the 19th century with regard to environmental destruction. And so we find ourselves facing huge issues. I just run 4 of them off for you so you've got a sense of what it is that we're facing. We have, for instance, and there's no particular order to this, plastic oceans, where what we're seeing washing up on the beaches and drifting on top of the ocean surfaces is really the smallest part of the problem. And we have climate change, not just the catastrophic weather events that we're experiencing and that are kind of really disturbing for all of us, but also the displacement of species and human beings across the world. We have, perhaps not as well known, Insectageddon, an enormous amount of loss of biomass in insects across the globe, and bees, the missing pollinators, may just be a sign of that, a really huge concern for us. And we have, of course, biodiversity loss and species loss far more generally, where it's not just wild, and it's interesting, it's not just wild and animal plants and species that we are losing at an alarming rate, but it is also cultivated varietals, the things that we rely on for food and nutrition. So, this brings me to the central thesis of this talk, which is that the economic model of global development that we have been invested in for the longest time, and since, in a sense, the Industrial Revolution began, has delivered the current environmental crisis. What I would like to call the ecological question. You see, I'm juxtaposing the social question and the ecological question. What we're now facing is a perfect storm. We haven't resolved the social question. And we find ourselves in a position where we have to address that and the ecological question. The doubt we must have is whether the means by which we have tried and failed to solve the social question will be fit for purpose when it comes to actually dealing with the ecological question. The answer, I think, is probably no. So if we look at the institutional settings and rules and regulations that we have in place at the moment, we may find that we are not particularly well versed in those terms. Why is that? I just want to give you one reasonably good reason for that. There are others, but this may well be enough for this talk. One reason is it has to do with a kind of pragmatic attitude that has been drilled into us to the point of having become second nature. We seem to think, when we're faced with a certain kind of problem, that we should just rely on the resources that we already have and use them as best as we can. So we have a United Nations system that is there to mitigate between competitive pressures among nation states. That's a nice thing to have. And that United Nations system, we hope, will give us enough to deal with a global problem such as the ecological question. Will give us enough resources to handle that properly. And so we become stuck with a consensus view that was handed down through this organization from 1987 onwards in the famous Brundtland report. And that consensus view goes something like this. We must have economic growth in order to solve environmental problems. And what is more, we must have economic growth before we solve the environmental problems. Solve the social question first, address the ecological question later. But there is no later, right? We are facing the ecological question right now. So, if we are finding ourselves in this perfect storm, can these institutions actually help us? And there's some good reason to feel that people are getting around to the idea that this problem is beginning to sort of show itself in a way that suggests that bigger changes must be afoot. One easy way to think about this is to look at examples where people are trying to use the institutional frameworks that we are having and bend them somehow to fulfill purposes that have much more to do with the logic of the ecological question than before. One example, I just ran one past you, would be that river in New Zealand that got legal standing, right? Maori activists managed to establish legal personality for a river that can now in principle go to court and have its interests recognized. and its interests defended in a court of law, and therefore get a good response in terms of whatever its needs are, right? Now, that is clearly, at one level, a weird idea. It's not what our legal systems were designed to do, but what it is also is a sign that, in fact, the institutional ground and the political ground is shifting under our feet. There are many more examples like that which you may not know about, but it's very important to see those sites where it's just creaking at the seams in terms of how the changes are kind of shifting things around, right? Now, if that's the case, and if it's such a tall order, and if we can't rely on the institutions that we have built so far in order to solve the kinds of problems that we've incurred with the ecological question, what can we do? What should we do? And one answer may well be to look to those people who have already been doing this squaring of the circle of the social and the ecological question, who have been involved. Some of them have been involved in it a long time. I will set that aside. Indigenous peoples, for instance, belong into that kind of category. I'll set that aside because I don't have enough time. But others have done this also in much more short-term and much more project-like fashion. And I want to focus on that because I can give you 3 examples of this. The important thing to notice about these examples is, in an interesting sense, they combine the social and ecological questions differently to come to new kind of approaches. But what faces all of them is that they're very much up against this framework of rules and institutional setups that has been put in place in the light of the Industrial Revolution's development, growth, and economic advancement paradigm that I have described earlier. So that remains inflected, as it were, to the politics only of the social question. So these examples are, all of them, in some way or other, up against that. The first example is Instituto Terra. Lilia Salgado and her husband, Sebastião Salgado, the famous photographer, owned a farm in the coastal areas in Brazil that coastal area that used to be rainforest. The farm, as many other farms in the area, was just reduced to compacted clay through to overuse. There was nothing there. It's essentially a desert. But Instituto Terra renaturized this desert within 15 years to bring the rainforest back. It's an enormous amount of work that had to go into it with lots of people helping, but at the end of it, we have had all the species back, enormous amounts of rodents, amphibians, and reptiles, and of course insects, when we talked about the insects that we have been losing, but also that particular farm-sized project now contributes the ecological services that the rainforest used to provide, such as water storage and the breaking of offshore winds, and therefore contributes to a healthier climate further inland in the area. It's a massive project if you want to think about it like that. The second example is very different. Imagine, and now you've got to imagine because I couldn't put any pictures up, unfortunately. Imagine a high-altitude farm in Austria, between 1,200 and 1,600 meters, very small, only 40 hectares, not a particularly large one. But it is set in what is normally not thought to be agriculturally very productive land. Around it are fir tree monocultures. That's it, pretty much. But that farm, run on agroecological principles and on the basis of a permaculture approach, is enormously productive. It produces enormous amounts of foods, all sorts of different kinds of things, but at the same time, avoiding all the problems of the monocultures around it. So, it is a great contributor to water household, to soil building and soil maintenance, but also a habitat for all sorts of critters, insects again, but also all sorts of other animals, wild ones as well, and a biodiversity hotspot as a result. This is an example of a human impact that has a positive effect. And the third example I wanted to run past you is of completely different scale. Think of something like the world's largest ever social movement. And it's called La Via Campesina. In it, organized, are over 185 million peasant and smallhold farmers. And they are addressing both the social and the ecological question quite explicitly. In the social question, they're very much concerned with nutrition, with getting healthy food to people, but also with the inequalities of access to food and poverty. That's the social question addressed right there for you. But on the ecological side, they're involved in seed sharing, plant breeding techniques, the exchange of information about how to farm in difficult places, and in landscape management. So they're addressing both in a package. And they have been quite successful in that they have also had an impact eventually through those struggles that I mentioned before at national government levels, but also now in institutions like the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Those are just 3 examples. There are many, many, many others. But what I wanted to impress upon you is that these examples are examples of activities and change agents who are doing things in the space that need to be done, while at the same time being up against a set of rules that is not particularly hospitable to what it is that they're trying to do. We can recognize that we should be doing more of those kinds of things. So, what can we all take away from this? First of all, we must become interested in such change agents. We must become knowledgeable about what it is that they're doing. And we must understand how we may be able to support them and think about also what kinds of rules, frameworks, and regulations they might need, might be conducive to others joining into that kind of activity, but also for them to maintain the successes that they have had. So it's up to us, in other words, to start lobbying our politicians to help manage change in a way that makes sustainability a real thing and not just something that we put and slap on top of a particular kind of set of ideas that usually are pretty much like the old ideas we've always had. That, for us, is the takeaway message. We must become knowledgeable about what these people are doing. We must expect the change agents to come from unconventional sources and to be unconventional actors. There's plenty of them around. Big world political change, this is a big secret, but not really when you think about it, never really comes from the top. The top is the last thing to fall in line with what's going on. You need to look for those changes somewhere else. And there are plenty of examples around. If we make ourselves smart about them, we can join the political movement and we can become part of that future that addresses both the social and the ecological question.